situations. Peace is actually found in the presence of someone, Jesus. Regardless of the conditions around you. It couldn't get worse, could it, than on the front line in the First World War. Let me read to you again the announcement of the arrival of Jesus. And we're reading from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 2, starting at verse 8. That night there were shepherds staying in the fields nearby, guarding their flocks of sheep. And suddenly an angel of the Lord appeared among them, and the radiance of the Lord's glory surrounded them. They were terrified. But the angel reassured them, "Don't be afraid," he said. "I bring you good news that will bring great joy to all people. The Savior, yes, the Messiah, the Lord, has been born today in Bethlehem, the city of David. And you will recognize him by this sign. You will find a baby wrapped snugly in strips of cloth lying in a manger." Suddenly the angel was joined by a vast host of others, the armies of heaven, praising God and saying, "Glory to God in the highest, and peace on earth to those with whom God is pleased." So this Christmas here at Kingfisher, we're asking the question, where is that peace and goodwill that they were singing about? Because, we as a country at the moment are marred by division. There are storms raging around us politically and some of us personally. And we need Emmanuel, God with us, the Prince of Peace, more than ever before, it seems. Christmas reminds us of the arrival of Jesus, but how do we experience that peace for more than just a moment or for a few hours like those soldiers in the First World War? Well, let's look again at the verse that we finished with last Sunday. This is my starting point, which says, it's from 2 Thessalonians 3, verse 16, and this is what we read. It says, "Now may the Lord of peace himself grant you his peace at all times and in every way, that peace and spiritual well-being that comes to those who walk with him, regardless of life circumstances. The Lord be with you all." And the important words that flash out to me from that verse are, to those who walk with him, those who stay in his presence, those who go the way that he is going, those who follow in his footsteps. If I am finding peace elusive, then I need to ask myself the question, how much time and attention am I actually giving to God? And if not, then what is getting in the way? What is stealing my peace? There's a very famous book. I don't know if you've heard of it. And it was published in the 17th century. It's been around a while. And it's a collection of teachings and letters and conversations with a man called Brother Lawrence. Anybody heard it? It's a very famous book. It's called The Practice of the Presence. Thank you, Laurie. It's called Practicing the Presence of God. Now, we don't know much about Nicholas Herman. That was his name originally, except that he was born in France to humble parents. He joined the army when he was young, and he served until he was wounded fighting Swedish troops. The injury made him lame in one leg, a disability that he had for the rest of his life. He went on to serve as a footman in the house of the king's treasurer, which wasn't much of a success by all accounts because he was clumsy and broke everything. That's what we read about him. It doesn't sound like someone who would be known for experiencing and emanating peace, does it? But here's what we read about him. There was a moment in his life that changed everything. And it says, in the deep of winter, 1629, at the age of 18, Herman looked at a barren tree, stripped of leaves and fruit, waiting silently and patiently for the sure hope of summer abundance. And gazing at the tree, Herman grasped for the first time the extravagance of God's grace and the unfailing sovereignty of divine providence. Like the tree, he himself was seemingly dead, but God had life waiting for him. And the turn of seasons would bring fullness. And at that moment, he said, that leafless tree first flashed in upon my soul the fact of God and a love for God that never after ceased to burn. Something so ordinary and mundane as a barren tree. And he had this revelation of God. You know, in 1640, he sacrificed his life for that love by joining the Carmelite order of monks in Paris. And from then on, he was known as Brother Lawrence. He was a lay brother. He was never a priest. And he worked in the priory kitchens. But he was to become one of the most inspiring monks in history on account of his method of prayer. The first time his friend, Father Joseph de Beaufort, met him, Lawrence spoke of a continual conversation that he had with God, referred to as the practice of the presence. He said, I make it my business only to persevere in his holy presence, wherein I keep myself by a simple attention and a general fond regard to God, which I may call an actual presence of God, or to speak better, an habitual, silent, and secret conversation of the soul with God, which often causes in me joys and raptures. His prayer, writes Beaufort, was simply the presence of God. His soul, unconscious of all else but love. By all accounts, its effects were beautiful. He is described as fearless and happy. His very countenance was edifying, says Beaufort. Such a sweet and calm devotion appearing in it as could not but affect the beholders. Wouldn't you love to be like that? That just being around people and you just emanate this sense of joy and love and peace. I've got a couple of his quotes coming up. This is one of them. Let us think often that our only business in this life is to please God. Perhaps all besides is but folly and vanity. But this hadn't always been the case. Lawrence describes how he had suffered for 10 years, both with physical impairment and emotions of rejection, self-hate, and guilt. It was hard to remain in God's presence, which is what he sought to do. Like the rest of us, he found his imagination was keen to focus on other things. Our mind is given to roving, he says. But since the will is the mistress of all our powers, she must recall the thoughts to God. The human mind is a difficult beast to tame. Of course, it can be tamed, but that mastery takes time and isn't helped by guilt. If your mind withdraws from him, Lawrence writes, do not much disquiet yourself. Trouble and disquiet serve rather to further distract the mind. His practice, that's what was written of him, his practice is one of terrifying simplicity. Like one plunged into the silence and emptiness of the desert, to be so quiet within is at first overwhelming. We are so used to the wanderings and mutterings of the mind, which flits this way and that, plunging into memories or emotions, or running ahead of itself in thought of what needs to be done. But Brother Lawrence's practice is insistent that those concerns become secondary. The secret to that accomplishment was his choice to adore God at every moment until it became as natural as breathing. This adoration, he found, enticed God to pour graces into him like a torrent until he was dwelling in the presence both in waking life and in sleep. The time of business does not with me differ from the time of prayer, he said. He even admits that he felt more at one with God peeling potatoes than he did on his knees in formal meditation. For Brother Lawrence, where's the next one coming up? We ought not to be weary of doing little things for the love of God, who regards not the greatness of the work, but the love with which it is performed. I love that. For Brother Lawrence, common business, no matter how mundane or routine, was the medium of God's love. The issue was not the sacredness or worldly status of the task, but the motivation behind it. Nor is it needful that we should have great things to do. We can do little things for God. I turn the cake that is frying on the pan for love of him. And that done, if there is nothing else to call me, I prostrate myself in worship before him who has given me grace to work. Afterwards, I rise happier than a king. It is enough for me to pick up but a straw from the ground for the love of God. Brother Lawrence retreated to a place in his heart where the love of God made every detail of his life of surpassing value. I began to live as if there was no one save God and me in the world. Together, God and Brother Lawrence cooked meals, ran errands, scrubbed pots, and endured the scorn of the world. He admitted that the path to his perfect union was not easy. He spent years discipling his heart and mind to yield to God's presence. As often as I could, he said, I placed myself as a worshiper before him, fixing my mind upon his holy presence, recalling it when I found it wandering from him. This proved to be an exercise frequently painful, yet I persisted through all difficulties. Only when he reconciled himself to the thought that this struggle and longing was his destiny did he find a peace. His soul had come to its own home and place of rest. And there he spent the rest of his 80 years, dying in relative obscurity and pain, but perfect joy. That's what it says about this guy. There was a man who walked daily with God, regardless of his circumstances. And despite the difficulties and setbacks, he understood and experienced peace in a way that would make all of us envious, I'm sure. I love that line that his practice was one of terrifying simplicity. Why is it terrifying? I mean, what it means is that what he learned about God's presence and what he experienced as a result is available to each one of us. Because what he was doing was not difficult. And if we would just stop with the striving and the competing and the comparing and the questioning, if we would stop making the secondary things our primary purpose, if we would lay aside our own agendas and just start trusting and loving and serving in obedience to Jesus, I thought to you to relinquish that level of control. But it leads to peace. You know, in his letter to the Colossian church, this is what St. Paul writes. He says, let the peace of Christ, the inner calm of one who walks daily with him, be the controlling factor in your hearts, deciding and settling questions that arise. To this peace, indeed, you were called as members of one body of believers, and be thankful to God always. You know, Brother Lawrence did everything from an attitude of love. That's what he wanted to do. No matter how small the task, he was going to give his all and do it for the love of Jesus. He constantly refocused his mind onto Jesus, finding joy and gratitude in the everyday tasks of life. No matter where he was, no matter who he was with, no matter what he was doing, constantly aware, reminding himself of God's presence with him. It says 3 things that I want us to take away from today in terms of living in that same reality so that we can experience the inner calm of one who walks daily with him. I want that. Is there anybody else that would like that this morning and over this Christmas period? Yes. So number 1, remember this. God is present in the ordinary and mundane. You know, the Christmas story really highlights this because it was while the shepherds, some of the lowest status workers of the time, just as they were about their daily business, what were they doing? They were watching sheep. And then the angels visited them in the midst of their ordinary life. I think we sometimes think we can only experience God if we're at church or at some conference or in the middle of a major worship event. Actually, the reason we do have those encounters with God in those those times, like when the youth went away at Soul Survivor, I think the reason why people have those encounters is because they are expecting God to meet with them there. It's not so much about the environment, it's about the mindset when you go somewhere like that. But what if we were just as expectant? What if we were just as attuned to him when we're doing our daily chores? Or walking to work? Or in the car? Or in the classroom? What if we were just then reminding ourselves that God is with us and expecting him to be working in our lives? Because the reality is that God is just as present there than he is in this moment here at church. You know, don't compartmentalize your life and think that you can only talk to God or hear from him if you're at church or in your connect group or around someone who seems more spiritual than you. You know, Jesus was not born in a palace. Unapproachable, unavailable, only to be accessed by those with the right connections. He was born in a stable, for goodness sake. It doesn't get much more ordinary than that. And the shepherds were some of the first who were able to come and see him. That should give you real hope this morning. In Ephesians 3 verse 12, we're told, because of Christ and our faith in him, we can now come boldly and confidently into God's presence. Because of Christ and our faith in him. Because of what Jesus did when he died on the cross. Not because of how good we are, or how spiritual we are, or how religious we are, but because of how good he is. That's why we can come into his presence. That's why we can come boldly and confidently. Don't let guilt or fear get in the way of you getting into God's presence. When you think you are at your worst, be reminded in those moments that God's grace is enough, and mercy and forgiveness are yours right now in that moment because of Jesus. Don't wait till you feel better. Don't wait till you feel like you've paid some sort of penance. Don't wait till you get to your next church meeting. You can be aware of his presence now, no matter how ordinary the moment looks or feels. Number 2, God gives value to the ordinary and mundane. You might not think that you have much influence in your life, or that the things that you do matter that much. I don't know. Brother Lawrence, if we're taking him as an example, he lived an obscure life, hidden away in some monastery, a life of service, but he made himself available to God. And he left the impact of his life to God. He didn't worry about achievements or status or whether he would be remembered. And yet, almost 400 years later, can you believe it? We are still talking about this guy. And his words continue to be an influence for good. If we just get on with doing the small things, the routine things, with great love, and leave the rest to God, it's amazing the peace and the joy that we'll experience. Just take the shepherds, these anonymous, don't even know their names, anonymous, unimportant men. They got to be told. They got to see. They got to experience Jesus. And to hear that great news that was going to bring joy to all the people. The best news on planet Earth. They got to hear it first. And it made them so excited. You know, so many of us, we feel overlooked. We feel undervalued. But if you know Jesus, then everything becomes significant. You know, the shepherds didn't return to work complaining and moaning about their lot in life. That is not what happened after they met Jesus. No, the shepherds went back to their flocks, glorifying and praising God for all they had heard and seen. Something in their spirit changed. It was just as the angel had told them. I mean, what a difference it would make if we realized what value and importance God places on our little, ordinary, mundane lives. The good news that we carry, that we all have the privilege of sharing with the world around us as we go back to our places of work and study. That no matter where we are positioned, we can make a difference just by knowing that God is with us in those moments and wanting, and where am I? I'm getting carried away. No matter where we are positioned, we can make a difference just by knowing that God is with us and by just us wanting to give our best to him in those moments. Sharing his love with people in the sphere of influence that we've got. We all have one. In Colossians 3:23-24, listen to this. We're encouraged, whatever you do, whatever your task may be, work from the soul. That is, put in your very best effort as something done for the Lord and not for man, knowing with all certainty that it is from the Lord, not from men, that you will receive the inheritance, which is your greatest reward. It is the Lord Christ whom you actually serve. No matter what the task you are doing, you can serve Jesus doing it. You know, God is found in the ordinary and mundane. He can give such value to that which we see as ordinary and mundane. And when we get that into our heads and have that as our mindset, we begin to see this, that nobody is ordinary and mundane in God's sight. Nobody. And none of us, if we're Christians, none of us is an ordinary, mundane Christian. He needs us in all walks of life to show others their value too. That's what we get to do. Each one of us has an influence. Whether that is at work, at school, at home, on social media, we have an influence. The size of that influence is not so important. It is what you do with it that is important. I have two nephews who currently work at a large church in London. One of them was telling me recently that they have 4 services on a Sunday at one of the big theatres in the West End. But due to the times of their services, the 2 services in the middle of the day, he said they don't have so many in attendance. And I was like, oh, okay, well, how many do you get? And he was like, at our 1:30 we only get about 1,000 people. What? It's all perspective, isn't it? 1,000. You know, I could easily look at that and start comparing and resenting my own calling and my influence here in Gloucester. But I've learned that God has me here for a reason. You know, the church, that church in London, it cannot reach the people here in Gloucester and in Treadworth. It doesn't have influence over them the way that we can. You know, God needs all different sorts and different styles and different sizes of church to reach different people in different places. And I know he's called me here. Don't know about you. And if that is to influence just one person and introduce them to Jesus, then my life has had an eternal value, hasn't it? It's not the size of your influence that matters. We get so caught. Social media is so much about this, isn't it? How many followers have you got? How many people do you influence on Instagram? It's not about that. But we have an influence. What are you going to do with it? Jesus told a parable, I don't know if you remember this one, about a man who called his servants together and he gave them each a different amount of talents. And when he returned, he wanted to know what they had done with what they were given. You know, it's not the amount that he gave each one of them. They all had different amounts. That was not about how much he loved each one of them or valued each one of them. But he gave them different amounts to do different things with. What have you done with what I have given you? No matter how small or insignificant or ordinary you think you might be. Just like those shepherds, when you meet Jesus, you are now on a mission. And it has an eternal significance. So go and tell. Go and be an influencer for good. Go and show love and kindness to those who don't yet know Jesus. Whether that is online or whether that is face to face. Use what you have and then watch God do something extraordinary with it. It's in walking with him and living for him that you will experience his peace. Jesus said to his disciples, "Peace I leave with you. My perfect peace I give to you. Not as the world gives do I give to you. Do not let your heart be troubled, nor let it be afraid. Let my perfect peace calm you in every circumstance and give you courage and strength for every challenge." You know, it took courage and strength for those soldiers in 1914 to put their heads above the trenches, to stop with the fighting, and to show some generosity and kindness. And that moment continues to be talked about in history. Let's practice the presence of God. Let's practice his peace on those around us. Who is in your sphere of influence? Who can you have a positive impact on this Christmas? But you know, to show peace and goodwill, you have to experience it. So I'd like us really to pray something together this morning. It's a very famous prayer. It's called the Serenity Prayer. Serenity is all about peace. So why don't we stand together? This is a prayer that we pray this every week at Celebrate Recovery, if you come along on a Thursday night. Because it reminds us of God's presence with us. It reminds us of the power of surrendering to his will. And it reminds us of making the most of every opportunity. Let's pray it now. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Living one day at a time, enjoying one moment at a time, accepting hardship as a pathway to peace, taking, as Jesus did, this sinful world as it is, not as I would have it, trusting that you will make all things right if I surrender to your will, so that I may be reasonably happy in this life and supremely happy with you forever in the next. Amen.